What's up? Today I'd like to suggest to you a really dangerous opening weapon against the most played move for black, pawn to e5. We're going to analyze a so-called Scotch Gambit, which arises from the Scotch opening here, but instead of taking this pawn with the knight, which is the main line, we're going to go bishop to c4, which is a lot trickier, a lot more aggressive. We're willing to give up the pawn for the sake of quick development and great attacking opportunities. You'll enjoy this line a lot because it is both solid, aggressive, and simple. But before we get right into it, let me also show you one tricky line that you can use in blitz games. Now, of course, bishop c4 is the main move, which we're gonna mostly analyze within this video. But before we dive into it, let me first show you a tricky line, which is knight to g5. As I said previously, this is a tricky line. That's not what I would recommend you to play against an expert level opponents, but against beginner to intermediate level players, especially in blitz, it actually works. What's the trick here? Well, when you go knight to g5, your opponent is tempted to play pawn to h6 to drive this knight away. And here, instead of moving your knight backwards, all of a sudden you sacrifice this knight on f7. And after they recapture, you give them a check bishop c4. Thanks to this sacrifice, you manage to pull the black's king away from safety, and now if they try to put it back to safety, going king to e8, then you just go queen h5, and all of a sudden it is a checkmate, quite similar to the scholar's checkmate, but you can actually execute it even against pretty strong opponents. Here in the following line, you just can see that the opponent's king is running around the board, and it is checkmated within this forcing line real quickly, just within 11 moves. Here's where it gets really funny. I've just opened a database of games, and you can see here in the corner the number of games played with one or the other move, and of course knight takes d4 is the main move, bishop c4, but if you look at knight to g5, just look at this. The most common response of black is pawn to h6, you take with the knight, king takes, bishop c4, and the most played move here is king to e8, which just leads to an immediate checkmate. So that is really funny. To be completely honest, of course, black does not have to move their king backwards and being checkmated. They can move their king elsewhere, and in this case, they would save an extra piece. But I would say that it's still not the end of the world for white. Let's say if they go king to e7, you can just keep playing in the gambit style, play pawn to c3 and recapture with a knight. And even though black is still having an extra piece and a computer would easily defend the position and win the game, in a real practical game against a human being, I think that you've got a great attacking chances here. Your knight can possibly jump here. The black's king on e7 is terribly weak and exposed, and you'll just have this long-term initiative here. Now we're going into the main Scotch Gambit line, which we're going to analyze for the rest of this video, bishop to c4, which is a real deal here. It's a good move that you can play against anybody, including Magnus Carlsen, if you ever have to face him. Now, here black would have a couple options, and we will analyze all of them. Mainly they would consider bishop to c5, protecting this pawn, maybe bishop b4, just to deliver a check to your king, and the last option would be knight to f6 to attack your pawn on e4 here. So these are the three main options black has, which can possibly create any kind of problems for you, and we're going to go over them one by one. Let's say they go bishop to b4 check. A really tempting move for black, taking advantage of their pawn on d4 so that it's not that easy for you to play pawn to c3 and drive this bishop away. Nevertheless, you play this move anyway, and after they take, it's important that you recapture with a pawn, not with a knight, because you want to gain a tempo by attacking an opponent's bishop right here, so that they have to lose this tempo for defense. And at this point, there are already a couple tricks here which will happen frequently in your games. First of all, if black tries to play safe and play bishop to e7, this fails to queen to d5, and again an immediate checkmate on f7 is actually unstoppable. If they try protecting it with a knight, you just take the knight first, and after that you still grab it with a queen and game over. I just put it back to the starting position of the Scotch Gambit. Let's see what else black can play after bishop b4, pawn to c3, and exchange of pawns. If they decide to move their bishop to c5, another natural looking move, which is a mistake. You can have here a pretty nice little tactics. Bishop takes f7, and after king takes, you have queen coming to d5 with a double attack to the black's king as well as the bishop, and therefore on the next move you're gonna get your piece back, but now your opponent's king is exposed, it can't castle anymore, and therefore black is going to have a long-term problem with their king, while the material is equal, which just gives you a great position. Going back to the starting position of the Scotch Gambit, let's see what else black can play here. We know that bishop b4 is probably not the best option for black, even though it's a tempting idea, and some of your opponents will definitely go for that. Another move which your opponents will often play here is bishop to c5, kind of playing an Italian game, or at least trying to transpose. And in this case, still you can utilize the great power of this bishop on c4. By the way, it also works together and hand in hand with another opening called Bishop's Opening, where you just put your bishop on c4 on the second move. If you haven't watched my video about that opening, I'll link it down below because it'll really complement this one. Very often the Bishop's Opening and the Scotch Gambit actually transpose into one another, so you may want to check out this video after you watch the current one. Now, coming back to the specific position, you can actually go for the similar tactical motif that we just analyzed. You play pawn to c3, offering this gambit pawn, and after they take, expecting you to recapture with a knight. Instead of that, you still utilize the same tactical motif. Bishop takes, queen comes out, and then you grab here the bishop. But before that, it's also very crucial that you give this intermediate check on h5. What's the point here? We'll take a look at this in just a moment. After black goes pawn to g6, you now grab the bishop on to c5, and now you can see the difference. After, let's say, black takes the pawn on b2 and you recapture with the bishop, now you can see how good it is for you that the black's pawn here is on g6, not on g7, because now this diagonal is a really painful problem for black. The only way to cover their rook so that it's not captured is to play knight f6, but now you just castle, and it is fairly obvious that black has a lot of problems here. Let's say they go d6, trying to push your queen away. You just go queen to c4. You may go queen g5, but I think queen c4 is even like simpler. You still centralize, and you keep a lot of pressure here along this diagonal, and potentially you are ready to break through in the center with a pawn to e5, and you're gonna chase the black's king directly. Let's see what black can possibly play here. They usually go rook f8 to remove their rook from this deadly attack of the bishop, and then you just play rook to e1, preparing this move pawn to e5, and in some lines that would really be deadly for black. Let's say if they go bishop g4, you can really break through with pawn to e5, and the black's position just falls apart really, because here after this trade you can easily see that you're gonna deliver the discover check by moving your bishop somewhere, and there is nothing black can do against it really. In addition to that, you're attacking here all of the black's pieces all around, and it is just completely winning. Let me also show you another common attacking idea here. Let's take a couple moves back here before black played their bishop to g4. Let's say black decides to move their queen to e7, hoping to play bishop e6 and kick your queen away. In this case, you simply continue with knight to c3, and after bishop e6, you don't have to move back. You go knight d5, you go forward, and now after an exchange, you open up the e-file, and again, this is just deadly. It's time for black to resign. And just to illustrate how strong this opening is, of once again opening a game database, and you can see that in this position, after you place pawn to c3, the top move, the most played move for black is pawn takes c3, unaware that you can actually take here and go for these tactics, and most players go to king e8, and here instead of queen takes c5, I suggest that you play queen h5, and after that you go into this line, which is really good for white. So here's the Scotch game once again. If they go bishop c5, trying to transpose it into the Italian game, you play pawn to c3, and we already know that most of your opponents will take this pawn going into a bad position. A better move for black would be knight to f6, and in this case, of course you can take on d4, but that would actually transpose it into the Italian game where you need to know a lot of theory. Therefore, instead I recommend that you play pawn to e4 right away. Your idea here is very straightforward. You're taking the knight. Also, if it goes away, you can easily take back the pawn on d4 and attack the bishop in this case. If they try to go forward with knight to e4, in this case there are a couple options that you have here, but I recommend that you just castle. It is the safest option for white, and in addition to that, you've got a really tricky attack here, which is the move bishop to d5. Let's say if black castles, just to show you. You've got this move bishop d5, and all of a sudden the knight on e4 is just trapped. It has no squares to go to. All of those squares are controlled by white. So bishop d5 is a real threat, and I'm just taking this move back. Therefore, black may decide to play d5 themselves. But in this case, after you take en passant and black recaptures by the knight, you've got a very important intermediate check, rook e1 check. Taking advantage of the fact that the black's king is still in the center, you can gain this important tempo by attacking the king. And the only normal way to cover it would be for black to go with their knight backwards to e7. And now you move your bishop away from attack because it's being attacked by the knight. So you move it away. Now you are going to take this pawn potentially, so black may wish to take there on their own. You take with the knight and they castle, hoping that now they're in safety and their position is good, but in fact this position is already losing for black because you've got this bishop g5, really unpleasant pin for black. Because of this pin, the black's knight cannot go away. It is also attacked by the rook from e1, so black is in a big trouble. Also notice that black can never push their pawn to f6 because of your bishop from b3, which is controlling these diagonals, so the pawn is pinned. And if they try to protect their knight by moving their other knight to f5, it looks good at first, as now it indeed provides additional support for this knight, but it fails to. Bishop takes f7, a very sudden tactical sacrifice here. What's the situation here? What's the problem for black? They can't take with a rook because in that case their queen on d8 loses the protection and you can just grab it for nothing. So that is completely bad for black. Let's take a move back here, and after bishop takes f7, if they try to take with a king, then their king is invited for a dangerous journey, and you play queen to b3. Now the king has two options, either to move forward, and there it will probably be checkmated, or to go backward, king to e8, and in this case you can simply continue with queen b5, double attack to the king and the bishop here. So after they play something like bishop d7, you grab this bishop on c5. Now the material balance is equal, but of course it is a disaster for black on this e7 square. Your attack is just way too powerful for black to handle. Let's take a few moves back here and see what could have happened if black's king chosen to move forward instead of going backward. We just saw that king to e8 fails to queen to b5 check. So let's see what's going to happen if king comes forward to g6. In this case, black's king is running around the board and you just simply keep chasing it with your pieces. Knight to e4 check, attacking the king and the bishop. And if it tries to hide there, then just queen h3 and the king is going to be checkmated on the next move like this. It's not a surprise that such an exposed king would be checkmated soon. So that's one of the really cool lines that you can utilize as white. And by the way, if you're enjoying this thus far, then you may also enjoy my free masterclass, The Best Way to Improve at Chess Instantly, where I share with you the 3 main ways how you can improve in chess in no time. You can click the link below the video and check this out. Now let's take a look at a more advanced way for black. After they play bishop c5 to protect their pawn on d4, and you play pawn to c3, we already know that taking this pawn is probably bad for black. If they go knight to f6 to taking your pawn, you push it forward with pawn to e5. And in the previous example, we analyzed that moving this knight away is a bad idea for black. More advanced opponents would counterattack with the move pawn to d5, which is indeed a much better option for black, because now they are not behind in development and they're getting a good game. Nevertheless, let's see what can happen here. You move their bishop to b5, putting the pin on the knight. Now the black's knight is still being attacked, so they have to move it. Now you take the pawn on d4 with a tempo, attacking the bishop, so the bishop would go to b4 probably, and you go bishop d2. In this case, you're not afraid to trade the black's knight on e4 because it's such a strong piece that it's actually good for you to trade it. And let's say black would now trade on d2, and after that they castle, thinking that the position is about equal, the material balance is equal, but in this case you can trade the pieces on c6, which would disrupt the black's pawn structure, and only then you castle. So thanks to this intermediate exchange on c6, black now has all these weaknesses on the c file, and you can very easily put your rook on c1 and start attacking them. If they ever try to play bishop g4, trading their bishop for your knight, you have a really interesting positional maneuver here. Knight's going to e1, and from here the knight is ready to be brought to d3 and later possibly to c5 to such a great outpost square, while the bishop on g4 is just doing nothing. In this case, you don't have any strong attack against an opponent's king, but you have a really strong positional advantage and a simple idea of attacking black's weaknesses on the queen side. Alright, finally we've got only one move left to cover, which is knight to f6, the most solid move for black here. And if they go knight to f6, you still push your pawn forward to e5, and here black needs to counterattack with that move pawn to d5. A typical idea for black, which we already analyzed previously in a slightly different line, so that would be the way to go for black. But just in case, let me quickly show you what's going to happen if they try to move their knight elsewhere. It really doesn't make that much sense, really, because let's say they are trying knight to g4 to attack your pawn on e5 twice, thinking that they're going to capture it. You can just ignore it and simply castle. And this knight on g4 is misplaced. You can anytime kick it away with pawn to h3, and if black tries taking on e5, it simply fails because after an exchange, you've got rook to e1, pinning the knight to the king, and after that, after they protect it, you just play pawn to f4 and just grab this knight on the next move. Once again, because of the pin, it can't run away, so you're just winning a piece for nothing. Alright, once again, we're coming to the final line here. Bishop c4, the starting position of the Scotch Gambit. Black here goes knight to f6, kind of trying to get it into the two knights game. By the way, if you're thinking that it can't be all that bad for black, it can't be losing all around, you're right. Of course, black hasn't played any really bad moves here, and his position is okay, or her position. But it just goes to show that you have so many attacking opportunities here that it is not a surprise that very often your opponents will fail to one or the other attacking idea that you've got here. By the way, if you're wondering how to play these kind of positions as black, I've got another video where I cover it from the black side, and I'm showing you a really aggressive line for black in the two knights game. Alright, anyway, let's see now from the white perspective. So we're pushing the pawn forward to e5, and we know that the best response for black is pushing their pawn to d5 with a counterattack. Now you go bishop b5, they need to move their knight away from the attack, so they go knight to e4. Now you take this pawn on d4 and also attack this knight on c6, therefore they need to protect it, playing bishop d7. You take on c6 with a bishop. You do not want to take with a knight, because in this case black would recapture there with a pawn and also attack your bishop here, gaining some tempo for their development, and that is why instead you prefer to take there with a bishop. Let's take a move back and play the correct move. Bishop takes, c6, pawn takes, and now you castle. And the position is approximately equal here, of course, but I'll show you a good attacking plan here for white. Normally black would develop their bishop either to e7 or c5. It doesn't matter that much, position is going to be about the same anyway. Now, the white's plan would, in the middle game, would be to push their pawn forward and potentially to start attacking the black's king there after the black's castle. But you can gain a tempo by playing pawn to f3 first, driving this knight away, and after it goes back somewhere, you then push the pawn to f4, and the knight would have to come back to e4, and you can easily notice that you just somewhat replaced your pawn from f2 to a more active position on f4 without losing any time, because black was jumping around with their knight. Now, the next move you want to play here is knight to d2. This knight on e4 is strong, and you'd prefer to exchange it. And you achieve this just by playing knight to d2. And after an exchange, you take it with a bishop, and now your central pawns are strong, ready to go forward and start an attack. If they ever try to drive your knight away by playing pawn to c5, you've got a cool maneuver here. You can play knight to e2 instead of playing it to the f3 square, and in a moment we'll see why knight to e2 is a good move. After black castles, here you push the pawn forward to f5. Notice that the pawn is supported by the rook, and that is why it was better for you to keep your knight on e2, not on f3, where it would block the rook. Also, here from the e2 square, your knight can join the attack after playing knight to g3, and then it possibly can even go to h5 and support your advancement pawn to f6. All in all, you've got a straightforward attacking plan here, just to somehow consolidate your pieces against the black's king and try to break through with pawn to f6. Even though position, objectively speaking, is equal and black can defend it, but in a real practical game it's just easier to play for white because you've got a simple plan and black still needs to figure out what should they do. Feel free to let me know in the comments below if you have any questions about this opening, or if there is any other opening that you want me to cover in my next videos. Hope that you like this video and give it a thumbs up if you do. Best of luck in your chess battles.